There are so many fantasy viable wide receivers right now in fantasy football, it makes it hard to know who we should be starting each and every week. That's why today we're breaking down my top 36 wide receivers for week 6. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there. Today we're going to be breaking down some wide receiver rankings. Now, obviously, it's a little bit different. We used to do all 4 positions in one show, but people wanted more information. They wanted more depth. They wanted more meat on the proverbial bone. So we listened to the people, and now we're going to have one ranking show for each position rest of season, but I'm going to be going a little bit more in depth for each player. Now, obviously, when it comes to the wide receiver position, it's hard to make decisions weekly. There's 50 wide receivers that probably have a pretty good chance of being fantasy viable each week. But really, if you want to find success in this game, we got to try to find the best players with the best opportunities and the best matchups, throw them in our lineups, and just hope for the best. Now, before we dive into the rankings, I got to shout out today's sponsor, Turtle Beach. And maybe you've been there before. Let me know if you have, but have you ever been playing Call of Duty or Fortnite, and it's an intense part of the game? You're coming down to the final 2 teams, and then all of a sudden, Steve's gone, right? He's no longer in you have no idea what the hell Steve's doing. And that's because Steve has a crappy headset or his batteries have died. And that's where Turtle Beach comes in, and now you can do some Christmas shopping, but I want to give you a discount. Now, Turtle Beach isn't just headsets. Whatever it is you need, whether it's controllers, keyboards, mice, they have you covered. They even have racing and flight simulators. But with Christmas right around the corner, how does 10% off your order sound? All you need to do is head over to turtlebeach.com. Whatever you throw into your cart, just use the promo code HEADLINERS at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Do not forget about this come holiday season. A lot of people, they're going to start their shopping a little bit early. It is October, everyone. So once again, head over to turtlebeach.com, get Steve taken care of, use the promo code HEADLINERS at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Now, if I was a nice guy, I would send Steve the pair that Turtle Beach sent me, but sorry, Steve, I'm going to keep them for myself. But actually, before we dive into that, let me talk about a few of my bigger hits and misses from just last week at the wide receiver position. The bigger hits, DJ Moore. We talked about a revenge game. The revenge game happened. How about Brandon Ayuk? I told people don't give up on Brandon Ayuk. This is a great opportunity for him here this week. He produced. And then Zay Flowers. A lot of people wanted to just jump ship on Zay Flowers. Dude's a bust. Dude isn't any good. Dude had a pretty good game. We can't be giving up on players so early in the fantasy football season. Some of my bigger misses, Deebo Samuel. For whatever reason, his usage is laughably low the last couple weeks. He did nothing in week 5. How about T. Higgins? He absolutely exploded, and there's no way I had him ranked high enough, and then Chris Godwin as well. He's still a top 10 fantasy wide receiver, but he did not live up to the expectations that I had for him in week 5, so he was a miss. But onward and upward, so here we go to week 6. But let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into the wide receiver rankings here, starting off in Tier 1. And right here in Tier 1, we got CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malik Neighbors, DJ Moore, Drake London, and Jaden Reed. So starting it off with CeeDee Lamb, he's got a matchup going up against Detroit, and some people are frustrated with CeeDee Lamb right now. But at this point last year, he was the wide receiver 20 overall. This year, he's the wide receiver 13. He started slow in the past, and we know what he did second half of last season, so don't panic just yet. We know Dallas is a pass-heavy team, and with Brandon Cooks out, a lot of targets are going to be going the way of CeeDee Lamb. Plus, it's a good matchup. Detroit allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After him is Jamar Chase going up against the Giants. He is currently the fantasy wide receiver 1. He's got 16 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games, 5 touchdowns over his last 3 games. We know the volume is going to be there weekly, but now the big plays are showing up more consistently. With Joe Burrow playing so good and T. Higgins back in the mix, it's moving some of the defensive attention off of Jamar Chase. And now a matchup going up against the Giants. They're really an average passing defense against opposing fantasy wide receivers. Not a horrible matchup. Got Chase at number 2. Then A.J. Brown at number 3 going up against Cleveland. Finally get A.J. Brown back and healthy. He's a full participant in practice. He will be out there in week 6. Now, the last time we saw him on the field, it was week 1. And he had a big week 1 with 119 yards receiving and a touchdown, but we haven't seen him since. We also know Devontae Smith is going to be back this week, and now they get a matchup going up against Cleveland, who allows the 11th most fantasy points per game game to opposing wide receivers because that defense is pretty banged up. After him, it's Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the Dallas Cowboys. He's coming off his bye week, and he's had at least 17 fantasy points now in 3 straight games. He's got touchdowns in back-to-back ball games and doesn't have a game this season with less than 6 targets. Now going up against Dallas, they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game, but they've played the likes of Cleveland, New Orleans, Baltimore, the Giants, and Pittsburgh. None of those teams are passing juggernauts by any means. Which then takes us down to Malik Neighbors. He's going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, he missed last week, but he should be back this week, and it's all about the volume. He is averaging 13 targets per game when he's on the field. Plus, Daniel Jones, it's crazy to say, is actually playing pretty well right now. In a matchup going up against Cincinnati, they allow 27 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so Malik Neighbors is back up inside the top 5. Then we go to DJ Moore. He's going up against Jacksonville, and he finally had a big game last week against his former team, the Carolina Panthers, but now he gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville. And there is no team in the NFL that allows more points to opposing fantasy wide receivers than the Jacksonville Jaguars. Plus, DJ Moore has had 8+ targets in 4 of his 5 games this season. He's up inside the top 10, I believe, for the first time this year. I got him at number 6. Then we go to Drake London in that matchup going up against Carolina. And I love to finally see back-to-back games with double-digit targets for Drake London. Plus, he's starting to find the end zone. Touchdowns in 3 of his last 4, and just had his first 100-yard game of the season. Now he gets the matchup against Carolina, and they allow just under 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We could be in for a big week for Drake London. I got him at number 7. And then Jaden Reed going up against the Cardinals. He's the current wide receiver 4 overall. He's averaging an absolute redonkulous 19.7 yards per reception. A lot more of a deep threat in 2024 than he was in 2023. He has had at least one play of 30 yards or more in 4 of the 5 games he's played this season. Now a great home matchup going up against Arizona, which will then take us down to tier 2, where it's DK Metcalf, Chris Godwin, Brandon Ayuk, Garrett Wilson, Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin, and Marvin Harrison Jr. Now for DK Metcalf, he's a top 12 fantasy wide receiver, and people don't really talk about him very often. He's averaging 13 fantasy points per game, and he's averaging his highest yards per game in his career. Now Geno, he's looking a little bit more like 2022 Geno and not 2023 Geno. That right there is a great thing for DK Metcalf in this matchup going up against San Francisco, and this defense just really isn't what it used to be. Then we got Chris Godwin going up against New Orleans, and people are starting to bail off of Chris Godwin already. Why? He's the current wide receiver 6 overall. He's averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game. He's had at least 8 targets in 4 of the 5 games this season. He had 15+ fantasy points in both games last year against New Orleans, and we love him in the slot. Now, why do I even mention that? Did you watch last week's game? Did you see what Juju Smith-Schuster did to the New Orleans Saints? That could be Chris Godwin this week. We know the battle on the outside between Mike Evans and Marshawn Lattimore is what everybody pays attention to, but Chris Godwin is flying under the radar right now. Then number 11, it's Brandon Ayuk going up against Seattle. And exactly what we talked about last week in my Don't Give Up video, it happened in week 5. Brandon Ayuk was going to get on track. He's got 10+ targets now in 2 of his last 3 games, and he's actually outscored Deebo Samuel on the season. But yet I see a lot more people talking bad about Brandon Ayuk than I do Deebo Samuel. I'm hoping last week was the equivalent to breaking the seal, and we start seeing a whole lot of Brandon Ayuk here in the near future. Then we got Garrett Wilson going against the Buffalo Bills. He had 22 targets last week. Boy, that escalated quickly. He had his first 100-yard game of the season, but how does this offense change with head coach Robert Saleh gone? I have a feeling the studs are just going to be unleashed. How does an interim head coach get his feet wet? By relying on his stud players. Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, they have to be a huge part of the game plan this week. Then we got Stephon Diggs. He's crept up the rankings, and he's got a matchup going up against New England, and he's this high because Nico Collins is going to be hurt. We're not going to have him for a few weeks, which means we should see more targets going the way of Stephon Diggs. He was already averaging 8+ targets a game over his last 3 games. Now, yes, Tank Dell and Dalton Schultz, they're going to be a part of this game plan as well. And the New England defense, really average when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers. But Stephon Diggs was already the number 2 option in this passing game. You have to think that he's going to get first crack at extra targets. Then we got Terry McLaurin going up against Baltimore. Now that Jaden Daniels has really hit his stride, Terry McLaurin is a weekly option for people. He's had a touchdown or 100 yards receiving now in 3 straight games. A matchup going up against Baltimore, they allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and it's way easier to throw on Baltimore than it is to run on Baltimore. Then we move on to Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against Green Bay. And Jonathan Gannon and this team are absolutely killing Marvin Harrison Jr. The dude is consistently open. He's winning 50-50 balls, yet he's only averaging 7 targets per game. Because of that, he's really touchdown needy right now. Luckily, it's a good matchup this week though, because Green Bay does allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's really crazy to see the difference in usage between Malik Nabers and Marvin Harrison Jr. Everyone on the field knows that Malik Nabers is getting the football, and they still force it to him. Marvin Harrison Jr. is out there begging for targets. It's just an overall really weird situation. But all right, let's move on to tier 3 now, where it's T. Higgins, Mike Evans, Deebo Samuel, Zay Flowers, Darnell Mooney, Deontay Johnson, Wan'Dale Robinson, and Tank Dell. For T. Higgins, he's going up against the Giants, and I think T. Higgins has finally gotten back to his normal self. 24 targets, 15 receptions, and 2 touchdowns over his last 2 games combined. We know that Zach Moss is banged up. Burrow right now is absolutely dealing. The New York Giants are an average defense against opposing wide receivers, and a ton of defensive attention is following Jamar Chase. Typically that leads to T. Higgins having a slightly higher ceiling. It's why I got him right here at the top of tier 3. Then we got Mike Evans going up against the Saints, and here we have it, the Mike Evans, Marshawn Lattimore debate. But here's what's pretty crazy. Mike Evans hasn't had more than 4 catches or 70 yards in a game against the New Orleans Saints since 2018. He hasn't even scored a touchdown against them since 2021. But he is the current wide receiver 9 overall and averaging just under 14 fantasy points per game. Now, the great thing about Mike Evans is he doesn't need 10 catches to have a great fantasy day. And with the way that Baker Mayfield is playing here as of late, we can't count out Mike Evans. I have to drop him down a little bit for the matchup, but only down to number 17. Then we got Deebo Samuel going up against Seattle. 3 targets and 3 carries in a loss to Arizona. I mean, he must have gotten hurt, right? Nope. He played 81% of the snaps. He's only had 8 touches over his last 2 games combined. Now, it's a great matchup. Historically, he's done well against Seattle. But for whatever reason, his usage is down right now, which means he's falling down the rankings to number 18. Then we have Zay Flowers going up against Washington. He's coming off his 3rd game with at least 10 targets, but for sure, he's game script dependent. But wait, aren't most wide receivers? A lot of stud wide receivers don't get peppered with targets if their team is up by multiple scores, especially teams with capable running games like they have in Baltimore. And Flowers is another one of those guys that a lot of people have written off, but did you know he's only 10 points away from being back inside the top 20 at the position? Now a matchup going up against Washington, who allows the 6th most fantasy points per game in a potential shootout. I got Zay Flowers right here inside the top 20. Then we got Darnell going full Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons going up against the Carolina Panthers, another guy we've talked about a lot lately, and he's coming off a game with 16 targets, 9 catches, 105 yards, and 2 tutties. Now, I can't sit here and say he is some weekly must-start guy, but in good matchups, for sure. A good matchup like this one going against Carolina, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game. After him, it's his opponent in that game, Deontay Johnson. Now, last week, Carolina couldn't really get going against Chicago, and Deontay Johnson has been dealing with some ankle soreness. But the target share is there, and with Andy Dalton under center, Deontay Johnson remains a weekly flex play. One thing that is pretty good here, Atlanta's a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, so Deontay Johnson's at 21. 22, it's Wan'Dale Robinson going up against Cincinnati. And actually, I like him a little bit more when Malik Nabers is on the field because so much defensive attention is looking his way. Now, Robinson is averaging over 8 targets per game. He's definitely a PPR guy because his yardage, it's a little bit lower, but in a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows over 27 fantasy points per game, we could see double-digit targets going the way of Wan'Dale Robinson once again. And then to finish off this tier, it's Tank Dell going up against the Patriots. He has to get more targets with Nico on IR, right? I mean, he absolutely has to. But so far this season, he has no touchdowns and has only gone over 60 yards receiving one time all year long. We all know the potential is there, obviously, but until we actually see him perform at that level in 2024, he's really a flex play at best. So that gets us through tier 3. Let's move down to tier 4 now with Josh Downs, Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, Devontae Smith, Jalen Tolbert, Brian Thomas Jr., and Amari Cooper. Now, news just broke not long ago that Michael Pittman is going to be missing some time with a back injury. But honestly, Josh Downs' value is strictly tied to Joe Flacco being the quarterback. And at the time of this recording, we don't know if that's going to be the case for sure or not. Anthony Richardson is back at practice, but if he's the starting quarterback, I don't know if I trust Josh Downs as much. With Flacco at quarterback, Downs has seen 8+ receptions now in back-to-back ball games, but no team allows less fantasy points per game to wide receivers than the Tennessee Titans. Now, really the silver lining there is Josh Downs will see the majority of his snaps out of the slot. So while guys like A.D. Mitchell and Alec Pierce may have a hard time getting open down the field, Josh Downs could absolutely feast without Michael Pittman. But like I just said, we need to pay attention who the starting quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts is going to be in week 6. If it ends up being Anthony Richardson, Josh Downs probably going to fall down the rankings a little bit. Then we got Chris Olave going against Tampa Bay. Now the Saints basically just have this dude out there running cardio every week, and now we know we don't have Derek Carr. It's going to be Spencer Rattler, and a lot of people don't know what to expect. But I can tell you this, Spencer Rattler is way better than Jake Haener. He's more mobile, and he's going to try to make things happen down the field. Now, who's he going to be looking at? Is he going to be looking towards Chris Olave? Does he still use Rashid Shaheed deep down the field? Does Taysom Hill come back? Do they utilize the tight end position a little bit more? Does Alvin Kamara get 52 checkdowns a game? There's just so many questions surrounding this offense, and with as bad as their offensive line has looked here as of late, it's really hard to trust Chris Olave. Now, after Olave is where I got Jamison Williams going up against Dallas, and really, he is pretty big play dependent. He only has 3 receptions over his last 2 games played. Now, he does have a catch of at least 50 yards or more, though, in 3 of the 4 games they've played this season. Going up against Dallas, they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game, but like we mentioned a little bit earlier, they haven't really played any teams that are super pass happy and really successful through the air. After him, we go down to Devontae Smith going up against Cleveland. He's coming off of his bye and back from the concussion that he suffered in week 3. We also know that A.J. Brown is back. Now, typically, that's going to mean a lower target share for Devontae Smith, but this Cleveland defense isn't scary anymore, and all he really needs is 1 or 2 big plays to have a fantasy viable day. I got him at 27. After him is Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys going against Detroit. And man, we've talked about Jalen Tolbert for months, and then last week, you kind of saw why. He is definitely needed in this offense. 10 targets, 7 catches, 87 yards, and a touchdown against Pittsburgh. We know Brandon Cooks is still out, and we know Detroit allows points in bunches to opposing wide receivers. Then we go down to Brian Thomas Jr. going up against Chicago. And really, he's become a weekly option. But is he going to be affected by the return of Evan Ingram if that happens this week? Now, Brian Thomas Jr. has had 90+ yards in 3 of his last 4 games, touchdowns in back-to-back games, and it seems like he's always open. But this matchup is tough. Chicago allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we really don't know for sure yet about Evan Ingram. And then to finish off tier 4, we got Amari Cooper. Now, a lot of people want me to bring back the Amari Pooper nickname, but honestly, this one isn't on Amari. It's all on Deshaun Watson's shoulders, figuratively and literally. But now they play Philadelphia here this week, and Amari Cooper is getting targets. They're just not catchable. 45% of the targets he's received haven't even been catchable targets. Now, it is a great matchup. Philadelphia allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but with the way that Deshaun Watson has been playing, he's absolutely killing this offense. Which means we only have tier 5 left, which is George Pickens, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Dontavian Wicks, Rashid Shaheed, Christian Kirk, and Khalil Shakir. Now for George Pickens, he's got a matchup going up against the Raiders, but the metric holds true. If George Pickens gets 8+ targets, he's a great start in fantasy football. The problem is the dude hardly ever gets 8 targets. He's got no touchdowns this season. He's super inconsistent, very boomer bust, and Las Vegas allows right around the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, I see people in the comment section from time to time saying, yeah, but he's not giving 100% effort out there, and that's why he's not getting more looks. Well, think of it like this. Imagine going to work every day and your boss tells you what you're going to do. And for the majority of the last year and a half, what your boss tells you to do results in absolutely nothing. How excited are you going to be when you show back up to work and once again your boss is telling you what to do, except now you know it's not gonna work? It has to be frustrating from a player's perspective. Now, is he absolutely handling it correctly? No, probably not. But I can kind of relate because I wouldn't want to go out there every week and just run wind sprints. Now, after Pickens, we got JSN, Jackson Smith, and Jigba going up against San Francisco, and I just love him as a bench stash wide receiver right now. 9+ fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, 8 targets a game. Geno's playing pretty well. DK has taken away the top defensive attention. JSN is a great bench stash right now, more of a flex play at best, though. Then we have Dontavian Wicks going up against Arizona, and man, he absolutely killed me last week. That's all me. That's my apologies. However, he still led the team in targets. He had some costly drops, just barely missed on some big plays. He had the same reception total as Marvin Harrison Jr. and the same yardage total as Deebo Samuel. The opportunity was there, he just didn't capitalize on it. Still a great matchup for him this week, though. Then we have Rashid Shaheed going up against Tampa Bay. He's a top 15 fantasy wide receiver, but we really don't know what to expect with Spencer Rattler under center as of right now. What we do know is it's a great matchup going up against Tampa Bay because they allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We saw Kirk Cousins throw for 500 against them last week. Then we got Christian Kirk going against Chicago, 10+ fantasy points now in 3 straight ball games, but he does not benefit from Evan Ingram returning. If that happens, his target share is going to take a hit, and in a difficult matchup against Chicago, I had to drop him a little bit in the rankings. And then lastly, it's Khalil Shakir going against the Jets. Buffalo for sure needs him back. He is their number 1 wide receiver, but he is still questionable with an ankle injury. Most importantly, Josh Allen needs his binky back in the game because this one is not going to be an easy one. The Jets allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but I could see Shakir racking up some check down plays this week from Josh Allen just to try to keep the sticks moving. So there you have my top 36 wide receivers for week 6 fantasy football. Now maybe you see some things a little bit differently. Honestly, probably 45 or 50 guys that could make a case for the top 36, but I can't fit them all. Now, hopefully you enjoyed this little bit more of a detailed breakdown of our rankings, and if you did, do me a favor and hit the like button before you leave. Now, if you're looking for more rankings like flex rankings, kicker rankings, defense rankings, those are a member perk, so consider becoming a member of the channel by hitting the join button just below the video. On top of the additional rankings, you're gonna get access to Discord, some additional videos, a members-only live stream, plenty of opportunities for you to come hang with a community that's full of positive-minded people that just want to have a good time playing a fun game. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.